debate, the honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to stand in this House today to speak on a motion that outlines the very core importance of making Indigenous children a priority in Canada. Mr. Speaker, today I speak in remembrance of my Granny Minnie, who spent years of her life in residential school at Lejac Indian Residential School from the ages of 4 to 16, who told me, "We cannot complain because we are still here. Never forget, we are still here." I also speak in remembrance of my father, who did not go to residential school, but lived with the impacts every day, both in his family and in the world around him, who reminded me as a young girl that the cowboys and Indian shows were wrong, that actually the Indians were the good guys. I speak for my husband, who went to residential school in Mission and who used to stare outside his window every day looking at the river, pretending it was the ocean where he grew up, who several years ago carved a beautiful mask called "Taking the Indian Out of the Child," which we know was the history of this country, that now stands as a reminder to all the children who go to school at Southgate Middle School in Campbell River of the history of this country. I also speak on behalf of my children and grandchildren, who have all come to speak to me about the racism that they face in this world. One particularly powerful story, Mr. Speaker, was of a time when my son, who was in grade 4, was sat down during library class, and a teacher presented a picture and asked the children in the class to tell her about that picture. My son, of course, knew immediately that it was a group of children who were in residential school. What shocked him the most was the fact that none of the other students know. So when they looked at the picture of sad children, the other students had suggestions that maybe the children were sad because they had missed a field trip. Maybe they were sad because they didn't get what they wanted for lunch. And all that pressure and pain was growing in my son as he realized that they did not know the history. And he finally said, maybe it's because these are residential school children who want to go home to their families. I also speak for my Auntie Dean, who is our hereditary chief from Stelacco First Nation from the Caribou clan. You know, Mr. Speaker, this summer I and my staff, in our commitment to reconciliation, took part in a training at the Comox Big House called It Takes a Village. It's an experiential training that connects people who have not had the experience with what really happens to children when they go to residential school. And so importantly, what happens to communities when their children are gone. I remember one of the elders telling me, "Rachel, think about it right now. Think about living in your community and every child between the age of 3 to 16 was suddenly gone. What would that do to your community?" At that event, the elders gave me a feather that I keep in my desk that reminds me that I speak on behalf of the people of North Island Powell River. So I also stand here for Alberta Billy, James Quittel, Evelyn Voyager, Mary Everson, Joanne Restol, Phil Umperville, Dave Summerfield, and the trainers Kathy Camilleri and Meredith Martin. This history gives me a beautiful burden to speak on today's motion. You see, Mr. Speaker, what all of these important people have in common is that everything they do in their life is for the children, because they know the children are our future. And we need to reflect the reality here in this House and make a real difference for these children who have suffered generation after generation after generation. We have to be brave enough to stand up and say we're willing to do the next step to make sure it stops here. It's time to make it clear in this House today that Aboriginal children matter. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal found the Canadian government racially discriminated against tens of thousands of First Nations children in systematically underfunding federal services that put their lives at risk. Mr. Speaker, here is one of the most painful questions that so many Indigenous people have shared with me. When, Mr. Speaker, when will our children matter? In fact, the court has already put out 2 compliance orders because the government is failing to meet its legal and moral obligations to First Nations children. With this government failing to respond to a court ruling on systemic racial discrimination of First Nations children, we are here calling on Parliament to step in and order finally that this historic wrong be righted. We cannot fail another generation of First Nations children. Mr. Speaker, the Minister is talking about an overhaul of the child welfare system for our Indigenous peoples. The Minister knows that we have heard this all before. How many more consultations and studies need to be done? Mr. Speaker, every day we talk about issues relating to Indigenous people in this House. I just want to take a moment to recognize the people who actually live there every single day and keep doing the work. They don't stop by for a visit. They don't go in to check if their research was done properly. They stay there every day and they see the compounded effects of residential school, of colonization, and it's exhausting work. And these people never give up. I can't even imagine how hard that is. The Minister was a member of this chamber when two government-commissioned reports during Christian years were documented the many shortfalls. There's been recommendations. Canada has never meaningfully implemented them. Instead, the Canadian government continues to do what it likes to do so much, is commission another study. Let's do some more consultations. You know, in 2005, there was a two-part study that found First Nations children on reserve received approximately 70 cents on the dollar compared to non-Aboriginal children. In truth, this was reiterated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Call to action. Call to action. Mr. Speaker, this is what is actually being asked for, a call to action. Number 3, we call upon all levels of government to fully implement Jordan's principle. As Cindy Blockstack once said, we need a government who is not going to just talk, that will actually act and alleviate the discrimination, because there are kids out there right now who are living in very difficult circumstances. We are losing another generation of First Nations children to wayward federal policies, and that has to stop. You know, the government has a shameful history of fighting families in courts. If no relationship is more important to this Prime Minister, who is also the Minister of Youth, than with Indigenous people, then this government must explain how it can possibly justify to not immediately end the racial discrimination of First Nations children. We have examples. Healthcare provides orthodontic care that is medically necessary. Requests are denied and repealed. I have to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I have the beautiful privilege of raising Indigenous children. And when we went to the orthodontist, they were very clear. This will take at least 3 tries. Don't be surprised. It will be denied every single time, and then we'll have to fight it. When you walk into a service provider and that is what they are telling you, then you know there is something seriously wrong. Mr. Speaker, here it is. First Nations children are 12 times more likely to be placed in foster care due to poverty, poor housing, and addictions rooted in the trauma of residential schools. The cost of providing equal funding for child welfare for this year is estimated to be around $260 million, identified by Cindy Blackstock, not the court. Following the ruling, the Liberal budget 2016 provided only $71 million for this year. Not all of this money will be going directly to those on the ground. The Liberal government provided $155 million less than Canada's legal and moral obligation to provide a year one for First Nations children in child welfare, and didn't even meet what was identified as needed in the Harper government. Mr. Speaker, we know that it is time. There has been a real call to action. We have a history in this country that we need to make right, and we have to stop punishing children for decisions that were made a long time ago. How much more do we expect these communities to take? We need to fix it, and we need to fix it now. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Labrador.
Speaker, and I listened very attentively to the member opposite in her remarks, and I want to remind her of a couple of things. First of all, when you talk about a renewed relationship with Indigenous people in this country, it has to be one that is shaped by a shared vision and a shared understanding of the way forward, not just by the ideas top down from one party or one member in terms of how they think that things should be done. What I want to be clear of here, Mr. Speaker, is that this government is the first government to lead the recommendations of the tribunal ruling, Mr. Speaker. We have acted on what the tribunal is saying, and we know the urgency of acting immediately for First Nations children in this country. That is why in July of this year, shortly after, Mr. Speaker, we accepted the ruling, shortly after we redefined and accepted the definition of Jordan's principle, adding services for 900 more First Nations children in the country, we also moved to invest immediately, urgently, $382.5 million in child welfare and child services in this country. I asked the member, is that not acting for children of First Nations communities in Canada?
The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Thank you to the member for the question. I think it's very interesting that somebody who grew up in this community, who works as an advocate, has worked in multiple Indigenous communities. I have a deep respect for a shared approach. I think that I would argue that this current government and past governments before tend to not listen as well as they could, and they are offering a top-down approach. You know, I just have to say, spend longer than a day in those communities. I know this is a hard topic. I know it's a scary topic. But when you live every single day in this, you understand it in a different way. It's not a visit. It's not a visit that makes the difference. I live on reserve, so. And you know what? I also want to say, Mr. Speaker, that I appreciate some of the action that's happening. It's happening every day, but we still need to do better. We need to do better.
Before going to the next question, I want to remind everyone that debate is taking place. It's nice to see everyone getting along cordially, but if you're talking, if you're not whispering, if you don't mind taking it into the lobby. The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech, and I really agree with her when she says this government is all talk and no action. It's been a year. Murdered and missing Aboriginal women, we've heard nothing. They talked about helping Indigenous children a year ago, still nothing. Mental health for Indigenous people, still nothing. I wonder if the member could comment.
The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, I thank you to the colleague for my question. I wouldn't agree that there has been no action. I think there has been some significant action and some steps that are moving in the right direction, and I appreciate that. But I think that the motion that we're discussing today takes it to that next level. This is a very specific motion that is asking for very specific action. It is also asking our government to stop taking children to court, to start doing the right thing and let it go and do what needs to happen. So I appreciate the action. I appreciate the dedication of many members on that side. But I also know that this motion is the right way to move forward.
Bravo. Time for a very brief